Dr. Kraut is a associate professor of French in the Department of World Languages and Cultures, where he has been on faculty since 2016. He received a PhD in linguistics from Georgetown University. Dr. Kraut teaches courses in the French language, literature, and civilization at Hope. He is co-director with Sandra Visser of the Emmaus Scholars Program, a group of faculty and students that fosters Christian intellectual community through shared meals, discussions, and worship. He is currently finishing a translation of essays and lectures by the French philosopher Fabrice Hadjadj, from which he will be drawing in his lecture tonight. This lecture is sponsored by Hope College's Green Team, the Department of Religion, the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Hope, and the St. Benedict's Institute. Please welcome Dr. Kraut.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you to Michelle Gibbs and the Green Team here at Hope, not only for organizing this event, but for your work generally on campus, and to the other sponsors, St. Benedict Institute, the Department of Religion, and my own department, World Languages and Cultures. And thanks to all of you for taking time, hello neighbors, taking time out of your week to come and hear this talk about Hadjadj. So, let me stir this up. Oh, and just a word, I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have another 45 minutes for questions and answers. So please be thinking of thorny questions you can ask me. In the last 30 years, sustainability has become a buzzword across institutions and in the marketplace. As a result, it's the type of word that would raise the suspicions, if not a leery eyebrow, of contemporary French philosopher Fabrice Hadjadj. One that he would, I think, characterize as a revered word, even a shibboleth. He says, "The words we use most often are also the most worn. Take, for example, the word being or the word love among Christians. And when on top of that, they refer to ultimate things, they can put a stop to conversation. We use them mechanically, without thinking. We rattle them off to end arguments. It's for culture, we say, or else it's a question of justice. Or in religious circles, it's the way to holiness. What do these words mean? We hardly think about them. We use them less for their semantic depth than for their practical efficiency, less for their meaning than for the consensus they produce among our listeners." My wife recently bought a set of measuring spoons with not one, not two, but 4 proud messages on the packaging declaring that the product was eco-friendly or otherwise salutary for the environment. Measuring spoons, mind you, not a car or an air conditioning system. Now, I don't truly mean to mock this impulse, though one may have reason to suspect the for-profit sector's practice of greenwashing products whose actual toll on the environment may turn out to be rather sobering. Still, the sentiment seems like a step in the right direction. And if someone were to ask why it seemed a step in the right direction, I suppose he or she might be greeted with a quizzical look. Well, of course. Isn't it simply obvious that we ought to preserve the planet? Inasmuch as our own survival depends on not destroying the place in which we live, perhaps this is obvious. But it is worth noting in passing that human flourishing has not always been a priority for environmentalists of a certain stripe. Indeed, a significant decrease in the human population has been claimed necessary to ensure the survival of the planet. I will not spend much time discussing this so-called deep ecology, but simply note the disparate motives there may be for pursuing sustainability. In addition to the practical rationale for preservation, that is, sustainability from necessity, it is of course true that many feel a sense of duty to protect the natural world, quite independent of their perceived dependence on it. It is as if the world laid some claim upon us to be treated with care or honor. Is this a hallucination? An anthropomorphic projection? Or is it in some way a real thing? A feature of the moral universe as concrete as the claim laid upon us by our fellow men not to be defrauded or murdered by us? And granting that there is some claim that we are supposed to protect or tend to the natural world, how should we do this? What is our relationship to the land supposed to look like? Well, there are many possible responses, and Fabrice Hadjadj is a thinker who has helped me to sift through them. Hadjadj is, as I have said, a contemporary French philosopher. He lives in Freiburg, Switzerland, where he directs the Philanthropos Institute, a residential learning community centered around philosophy, art, and Catholic spiritual disciplines. Hadjadj, who describes himself as, quote, a Jew with an Arab name belonging to the Catholic faith, has authored more than 30 books and essays on technology, transhumanism, ecology, art, and a range of other subjects, and has also published a number of plays, a trilogy of children's literature, and even put out a musical album. He also has 10 children and a full-time job. Though he has received several major French literary prizes for his work, he is largely unknown in the Anglophone world, his writing very rarely translated into English, and even less often analyzed by English-speaking scholars. I've been working on a translation of a number of his essays and lectures on ecology and faith, and I'm glad to be able to share some of his thinking with you tonight. It is hard, though, to speak of ecology and faith in America today without reference to another writer, the Kentucky farmer and man of letters, Wendell Berry, whose deep reflections on the land and our place in it have become a touchstone for so many who have tried to think through these questions. Berry, who may be well known to some of you, has for many decades offered an incisive critique of our failure to see the land, and consequently to use the land, as we ought to. He is, without question, our country's foremost agrarian author, that is, one who, as Ellen Davis puts it, endeavors to think and to order communal life in a way based on the health of the land and its creatures. He, like Hadjadj, draws upon a biblical vision of the world as God's creation, one whose great economy has its own natural order and laws which transcend our human uses of it. Hadjadj's own ecological writings offer an account of our relationship to the land that is in many regards complementary to Berry's. My aim for the remainder of our time together is to bring these two writers into dialogue as I answer the questions I'd posed a moment ago, though I will give Hadjadj pride of place since his work is less well known. So then, how are we to care for the creation, and why? For the question of how, we'll develop two responses. And by the way, if you, like me, are the type of person who craves some kind of mental outline for the talks you're listening to, this is your moment. Or if you're a student who needs to write something about this later, this is your moment too. So, two responses to the question of how. We care through relinquishment and through stewardship. For the question of why, there are three. For our own sake, for our neighbor's sake, and for the Creator's sake. One final brief note on the structure of what follows. I'll be drawing from a number of different texts from Hadjadj and Berry, but principally here at the beginning from a lecture Hadjadj gave in 2007 entitled The Sabbath of the Earth that will see us through the first number of points that I've mentioned. So I'll begin with relinquishment. The Sabbath of the Earth is a meditation which begins not with the land, but with us, men and women made in the image of God. In what does this image consist? The Genesis account immediately presents something of a quandary. There are two possible ways of being like God mentioned. The first comes from God himself. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." That's Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. But it is not God who speaks of this likeness next. The serpent said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." To be like God thus appears both as the supreme sin and at the same time the supreme holiness. Everything turns on where one draws the line. How might one distinguish the two forms of likeness? A key moment occurs in the transition from the sixth to the seventh day of creation. On the sixth day, man is commanded, and for Jews this is the first mitzvah, to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. We'll return to the question of having dominion a bit later on. Important for now is to note the timing. That is, this commandment to fill the earth and subdue it, to have dominion over its creatures, is immediately followed by the seventh day, which is sanctified, and on which man awakes all ready for his work, but which turns out not to be a work day. It is a day of rest. So there is a call to action followed immediately by a day of rest. True, in the account of Eden, the commandment to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy has not yet been announced. But the Sabbath has already been established. There are limits in the garden. There is a tree left at rest, Hadjadj says. There is a sabbatical tree. One must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so we see that, quote, the connection to Shabbat, or the Sabbath, is found in a type of relinquishment, or in any case, a restraint. It is possible that knowledge, that wisdom itself is to be found in this relinquishment, in this dispossession. End quote. Let's take a moment to ponder this, especially you, Hope students in the audience, you go-getters, club presidents, you triple majors. But really, I mean all of us who are inwardly proud when we're asked how we're doing, and we say, with a hint of wistfulness, that we're good, but we're just so busy. This idea that wisdom may be found in relinquishment, in letting go, rubs us the wrong way. But Hadjadj reminds us that in traditional monastic teaching, the sin of spiritual laziness, sloth, is marked by hyperactivism, though it be for the most charitable of causes. That activism, which avoids worship, avoids Sabbath, avoids contemplation, that is sin. I will quote Hadjadj again here. What is the significance of the Sabbath? It is in the fact that man recognizes that even if he must work all the other days, the most important day, the day where he is sanctified, is the day where he does not work, the day where he rests like God, the day where he is receptive to him, who is the creator and savior of the universe. There is a declaration of powerlessness, the recognition of a finitude, much more important than the finitude of death. And notice, by the way, that death appears at the moment when man refuses to recognize this finitude before his creator, since he wants to become like a god himself. Sabbath rest is not passive. Neither, as American Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel observed, is it a matter of simply replenishing one's strength for more work. The Sabbath is marked by active receptivity. Hadjadj goes so far as to call this contemplative receptivity, a point to which we must return. Here I will simply add is perhaps another way in which we might hope to be like God, in a becoming way, that we see with him that his creation is indeed very good. And that is easy to miss if we're incessantly working it to our own ends. Hadjadj cites a beautiful passage from Steinbeck in a more recent essay. This passage, which laments the large-scale agricultural operations that had begun decimating small American farms, is taken from The Grapes of Wrath. He had used a French translation, but we have the benefit of hearing this in the original. They, that is the owners of these large-scale farming operations, they had these things so completely that they did not know about them anymore. They had no more stomach-tearing lust for a rich acre and a shining blade to plow it, for seed and a windmill beating its wings in the air. They arose in the dark no more to hear the sleepy birds first chittering and the morning wind around the house, while they waited for the first light to go out to the dear acres. These things were lost, and crops were reckoned in dollars, and land was valued by principal plus interest, and crops were bought and sold before they were planted. There is no receptivity here. There is only grasping. In his seminal essay, The Unsettling of America, Wendell Berry also reflects on our need for relinquishment as he speaks of human limits in the context of our modern industrial society that seems to promise limitless growth. He says, "The arguments for cheapness, efficiency, labor-saving economic growth, etc., all point to infinite industrial growth and infinite energy consumption. The moral argument points to restraint. It is a conclusion that may be, in some sense, tragic, but there is no escaping it. Much as we long for infinities of power and duration, we have no evidence that these lie within our reach, much less within our responsibility. It is more likely that we will have either to live within our limits, within the human definition, or not live at all. The energy crisis is not a crisis of technology, but of morality, and it reduces to a single question. Can we forbear to do anything that we are able to do? We can make ourselves whole only by accepting our partiality, by living within our limits, by being human, not by trying to be gods." So far, we've been speaking about human beings and our need for Sabbath relinquishment. What about the creation? A fuller account of how our essence as creatures made for Sabbath bears on our relation to the land requires us to dive deeper into the Torah's ecological imperatives, especially in Leviticus. As we do so, let us heed Hadjadj's caveat, one which Berry echoes as well. What we read in Scripture concerning the land may seem, quote, unachievable and therefore utopian. But, says Hadjadj, it forms a horizon for a community and not just an individual who needs to save himself. Many things in Scripture, I would add, could be slapped with these labels. Unachievable, utopian, go and sin no more, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, love your enemies. There are 5 Sabbath-oriented ecological principles Hadjadj highlights from Leviticus, the central book of the 5 books of the Torah. We see in them how the call for relinquishment relates to the land, but also, and relevant to our second point about how to care for the creation, we see the model of stewardship. Hadjadj first considers the command to leave the edges or borders of the land alone. Leviticus 19:9 says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very end of the field. You shall not gather the gleanings of your harvest, and you shall not glean your vineyard, and you shall not gather the fallen fruits in your orchard, but you will leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." In this prohibition from squeezing every last drop of productivity out of one's field, Hadjadj sees an important implication. We leave the edges of our fields alone because we are not the creators of the earth. The land is not entirely ours. We have received it, and therefore cannot claim complete control. There's something amiss, is there not, in a person who receives a gift or an inheritance which he comes to regard as absolutely his own. His entitlement is precious. My kids would be very disappointed in that impersonation of Gollum from Lord of the Rings, but it's being recorded, so I have to be careful. Amiss about a person who comes to regard this gift as absolutely his own, whose value must be extracted and enjoyed solely by him. What is more, the relinquishment in question here in Leviticus is precisely how God's mercy is made manifest. The border whose fruits we do not insist on grasping, God intends for the downtrodden. A second sign of the Sabbath, inscribed in the biblical land ethic, is the non-consumption of blood. Why this prohibition? If we are to eat animals but not take the blood, this means that the blood belongs to God. Leviticus 17:14 says, "For the life of every creature is its blood is its life, and God is the source of all life. I do not claim to have power over this source, nor do I derive my own life from the blood of animals. But rather again, in a spirit of Sabbath, I receive my life from God." The third sign is the Sabbath of the earth itself. In Leviticus 25, we read, "When you enter the land that I give you, the earth will undergo a Sabbath for the Lord. For 6 years you will sow your field. For 6 years you will prune your vineyard, and you will reap its produce. But the 7th year, the land will have its sabbatical rest, a Sabbath for the Lord. You shall not sow your field. You shall not prune your vineyard. You shall not reap your ears, neither shall they be sheaved, nor shall you harvest your grapes, which shall not be pruned." Hadjadj observes that we have here, once again, the analogy of the border. I'd like to quote him at some length. "We had a spatial border, and now we have a temporal border, a border at the end of 6 years, and the 7th year as the edge of time. This notion of the edge is interesting because it is really the limit between the domain of man and the domain of God. And this limit between the domain of man and the domain of God is mercy. Because there again it will be explained in Exodus that the poor and the foreigner, and the animals too, will be able to feed on the produce which grows on this fallow land. Note that this letting the land lie fallow is not aimed to make the soil more fertile, a fallowness that has productivity as its goal. It is not that at all. It is relinquishment itself. And this relinquishment can have disastrous consequences because it is obvious that if one has not gathered enough in previous years, one finds oneself faced with possible famine. We are no longer in the logic of safety, of extreme foresight. Of course, we're not reckless, since we are told that we must stock up for this sabbatical year, but one cannot be absolutely certain of foresight. There is truly a surrender of oneself to God and his providence. This earthly Sabbath is received according to the following principle. The earth is given to me as a mercy from God, and because of this I show mercy to others in the 7th year, since I give the fruits that grow on this earth to the poor and the foreigner. I am in this land of the border, always the border, which is left to mercy." We see here that our restraint, our relinquishment with respect to the earth, bears directly on our care for our neighbor. It is significant that one person's rest results in another's rescue. This is not a mindless transfer of treasure, a tithe or charitable gift automatically deducted. The same is true of the next feature of the Bible's land ethic. This is number 4, which Hadjadj analyzes, the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee dictates that once every 50 years, anyone who has incurred debts and needed to sell his land will have it returned to him. A restoration of the original territorial boundaries established when the Israelites first settled the land. Leviticus 25. "You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall sound the sound of the trumpet throughout all your land. And you shall declare this 50th year holy, and declare the freedom of all the inhabitants of the land. It will be a jubilee for you. Each of you will return to your property. Each of you will return to your clan." This may seem to us perhaps the most utopian principle of them all. Every 50 years, the balance sheets return to zero. The debtor receives his land back, meaning the creditor must give it up. Could anything seem more opposed to the economic paradigm in which we live today? One in which the haves prosper exponentially, while the have-nots find themselves deeper and deeper in the hole. Hadjadj would have us notice that each man only sees the Jubilee once in his life. It's as if, Hadjadj says, the passage from one generation to another implied a Sabbath, a settling of accounts, the possibility of offering to future generations, as we say today in ecology, this new beginning. Next to the Sabbath, Hadjadj maintains, we can see the boundary markers, the stones which delimited an Israelite's territory, as almost another kind of sacrament. Quote, "It is a principle of freedom that we return to the original state of things, that each man should return to the field of his fathers." End quote. Freedom, I would add, for the debtors and for the fabulously prosperous, since the one who accumulates endlessly is just as trapped as the one who finds himself with debts he cannot pay off. It is easier, as we know from Scripture and from daily experience, for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. You cannot serve two masters. The Sabbath of the earth would go some way toward relieving us of the problematic one. Indeed, divine judgment is central to the final sabbatical principle Hadjadj references. After the chapter on the Great Jubilee comes a chapter on blessings and curses. Blessings flow when God's commandments are observed, central among them the keeping of the Sabbath. Curses follow when these commandments are flouted. And the curses become increasingly dire. Pestilence, famine, and foreign invasion, all culminating in the specter of the Israelites perishing from among the nations. There's a tragic irony at work here. In our striving to become, quite literally, lords of the land, working it however we want, we shall find ourselves evicted and homeless. Leviticus 26. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate, while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall have rest, the rest which it had not in your Sabbaths when you dwelt upon it. For Hadjadj, only through a belief in a final judgment and a great jubilee can we retain a sense of how to live properly on the land. And his conclusion, after considering these Sabbatarian principles for man's relation to the earth, is as simple as it is outrageous to our modern, productivity-oriented minds. He says, the earth is a gift. It is not our final home. In light of this, I must not appropriate it entirely to myself. The challenge is to let it rest and to orient myself towards that which is higher, to that which transcends the earthly realm. That is the meaning of the Sabbath. For Berry, too, the idea of the earth as a gift and not an entitlement has singular significance. It underlies the biblical principle of stewardship, the responsible use of what is not one's own. But this is not always our posture toward the land. In his essay, God and Country, Berry explores the betrayal of this basic imperative through a misreading of Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it. For some, this verse gives unconditional permission to use the world as they please. But not only does such a reading contradict, as Berry says, virtually all the rest of the Bible, including some of the passages we just read, it is logically self-defeating. For, Berry asks, how would one arrange to replenish the earth if subdue means, as alleged, conquer or defeat or destroy? Our dominion over the earth and its creatures, rather, is conditioned by the idea of the usufruct. Usufruct, a legal notion, which the Oxford English Dictionary defines as the right of temporary possession, use or enjoyment of the advantages of property belonging to another, so far as may be had without causing damage or prejudice to this. In this light, we can argue that yes, the earth does lay some claim on us, or rather, the fact that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it carries implications for our posture toward it. Let me try an imperfect analogy. Say your friend has gone away and left you the use of his house for a week. The house, you find, is a magnificent mansion filled with the finest handcrafted furniture, breathtaking artwork, all of which you know is his own. The garden in a state of pristine order. The refrigerator stocked with fine foods. The wine cellar. I'll stop there, you get the point. There would be something grotesque about your occupying this house for the week in a slovenly and selfish way. Your footprints all over the carpet, fine china broken as you rushed from one meal to the next, half of which you didn't bother to finish, the garden trampled as you hunted for vegetables, the artwork damaged as you rearranged rooms for a better view, etc. And it would be grotesque for two reasons. First, because it would reveal your pride and presumption in using things as if you had a right to do so in any way that pleased you. And secondly, because you had used them in ways which dishonored the goodness of the things themselves, and by extension, their maker. In this case, your friend. We can see now that there is a connection between relinquishment and stewardship, the two principles for how we are to relate to the earth that we've been discussing. Stewardship implies restraint in order to not cause damage or prejudice to what is not ours. But this is only a negative way of understanding stewardship. There is more to be said. And it will take us into the second part of my remarks tonight, the shorter part, as we consider the question of why we ought to care for the earth. Earlier, I suggested that there were three reasons why care of the creation mattered, for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for the Creator. In fact, we've already caught glimpses of all three of these reasons by now. With respect to our neighbor, we have seen how out of our rest and relinquishment come the fruits of mercy by which God intends for the needy. More broadly, as we are all too keenly aware by now, the earth is our great commons. Pollutants from China and India seed smog in Los Angeles. Plastic waste from the United States and other wealthy nations ends up in Indonesian waterways. We are connected whether we'd like to be or not. Berry writes, again in The Unsettling of America, that it is, quote, impossible, ultimately, to preserve ourselves apart from our willingness to preserve other creatures, or to respect and care for ourselves except as we respect and care for other creatures. And, this is the key, it is impossible to care for each other more or differently than we care for the earth. Now I know what you're thinking. I don't send my unrecycled plastics to Indonesia. I didn't create the smog in LA. Yes, but you and I and Fabrice Hadjadj and Wendell Berry participate in systems which in the aggregate have these or similar consequences. What matters is to reclaim, in the face of such systems, a sense of forbearance and care, or put negatively, to resist what Pope Francis has called throwaway culture. To insist, as Berry does, on health as the goal, as opposed to what he calls cures, ad hoc measures, often involving faceless government programs or technological innovation, which half the time makes things worse. He says, only by restoring the broken connections can we be healed. Connection is health. And what our society does its best to disguise from us is how ordinary, how commonly attainable health is. These connections are restored most promisingly in small ways, often ways closely linked to our physical surroundings. Through the planting of a garden that both nourishes and exercises the body and brings mouths together around a table. Through the use of manure as a fertilizer, which keeps animal waste from becoming a pollutant and chemicals from entering our food. But human virtues are necessary for health as well. Observation, devotion, imagination, reverence, and perhaps most importantly for Berry, restraint. Further, it is clear that even these virtues must be cultivated in relationship to a particular place. How do I know what restraint would mean if I don't know how much my field can produce without damaging it? Hence the importance of neighborliness. Well, so much for neighbor. What of ourselves and of the Creator? Let us begin with ourselves. If honoring these principles of the Sabbath of the earth constitute acts which reveal God's justice and bring health to human communities and land alike, they are also acts which profoundly affect the individual, restoring her to herself. How is this so? Hadjadj would have us think etymologically here. The word culture, the root of agriculture, derives from the Latin colere, which has three meanings: to care for, specifically the land, to dwell in, and to honor. The word cult is a derivative in English. Culte is still the French word for worship generally. Why the association between land and giving honor or worshiping? Is it because nature is capricious and needs to be appeased? No. It is because the farmer must be responsive to the intrinsic vitality of the earth. He is accompanying the growth of natural forms rather than fabricating. Hadjadj says, to cultivate is to welcome a natural process, a dynamism that we have not produced, to lead it to a new flourishing. It is for this reason that there is both a dimension of honoring and hospitality which point the farmer toward the transcendent. Natural forms imply a natural former. But of course, the term culture has come to apply to people as well. We build and participate in a culture. And now we're approaching our question: in what sense is our care for the creation for our own sake? Our human cultures must seek to develop our human natures, which are given, not chosen. And what is more, bestowed by a giver who seeks our good. Hadjadj quotes St. Francis de Sales. Let us be who we are, and be it well, to give honor to the master craftsman whose work we are. How are we to be who we are well, one of the meanings of culture, to care for, in order to honor our maker, another meaning of culture? For Hadjadj, some connection to the land, to material reality more generally, is indispensable here. And maybe this is not an entirely wild idea to suggest to a room full of people who lived through a couple of years of Zoom purgatory during COVID. Though we have come to think of ourselves this way, we are not essentially spirits trapped in bodies that are of secondary importance. Our connection to the concrete physical creation constitutes an indispensable feature of our own development. Hadjadj says, the work of the hands disposes us to contemplation. As he wedges and finesses his clay, the potter is in dialogue with the earth. He knows that it is not mute, that it reacts to his touch, that it requires both tenderness and respect in order to welcome its form without breaking it. The vine dresser deals now with a generous soil, now with an inhospitable one, cognizant of the delicacy required to accompany the vine in its growth. Wisdom has compared herself to him. The word became a carpenter, aligning posts before proffering parables, carving wood identical to that used for his cross, while the seraphim sang to the beat of his tools. Through manual labor, our minds learn to appreciate reality's raw material and stand on the same level as the works of that other mind who organizes it like a symphony. Of course, certain forms of asceticism and contemplation can compensate in the life of the mind for a lack of manual labor, but since everything begins in a garden, it often helps to return there, tending the vegetable patch, milking the cows, pricking one's finger while repairing a fence, so that we may avoid the smoke and mirrors of hollow thinking. End quote. And of course, that means not only having a sense of the techniques required to best welcome and accompany the natural dynamism in the land, that could, after all, simply be a stepping stone on the way to exploiting it to its maximum capacity. No. One also needs to do this work, abiding by the principles of the Sabbath of the earth described before. For something profound is accomplished within the person who honors the Sabbath. She more fully assumes the imago Dei. With respect to our use of the land, then, we are who we are meant to be, and we are who we are meant to be well by working, but also by resting from our labors in the land. Obviously, not everybody is a farmer. Hadjadj himself acknowledges that he is not, and, like Berry, does not expect that everyone should be one either. But he says that if the land for him is not a resource, it is at least a source, a point of reference that teaches, for example, the patience to wait for the fruits of this life to grow rather than expecting the world to move at the push of a button. A point of reference which reminds us that there are forces beyond our control. An arena in which we may see concretely what it would mean to imitate God's justice and partake of his rest. The earth, Hadjadj says, is neither indifferent nor superfluous, but rather, as a support for our reason, it is the foothold by which we make our ascent. Let us now turn to our final point. The second reason why we ought to care for the creation, for the Creator. We've discussed the negative or protective dimension of stewardship, the responsible caring use of another's property so as not to damage or prejudice it. But more remains to be said, since not everything in the world that we are called to steward enters into our human, practical economy. There are doubtless many animal and plant species for which we have conceived no use, and places we have deemed unimportant. But all are made by God, the useful and the useless, and we are told in Scripture that he delights in them. Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. I don't know why I felt like I needed the King James for that one. Wendell Berry qualifies this verse as relentlessly practical, and he comments, our responsibility then as stewards, the responsibility that inescapably goes with our dominion over the other creatures, is to safeguard God's pleasure in his work. And we can do that, I think, I don't know how else we could do it, by safeguarding our pleasure in his work and our pleasure in our own work. End quote. If we are to be stewards, we are not to be so as the dreary, pragmatic keepers of an estate of which we have no part, like some disgruntled employees of a property management company who happen to be sleeping on the premises they're maintaining. Rather, our care is to be undertaken with delight and with thanksgiving toward the owner. In the earliest essay I found of Hadjadj's on ecology, one hears an echo of this Berryan sentiment, an echo which is carried down throughout the more than 20 years of his ecological writings since. He says, what matters is to receive the land as it is, and it is not there for us to be its slaves or its tyrants, but rather its surveyors, struck with wonder and awe. Before cultivating and exercising dominion over the earth, Adam gives each creature its name. Before being arable, the earth is intelligible and good in our sight. As far back as we can go in human history, we see that the harvest has always occasioned admiration and feasting. The land invites the gaze of the contemplative as much as it does the farmer's spade, and this gaze is the source and summit of our labors. Toward the beginning of my remarks, I had suggested that for Hadjadj, the Sabbath was not a passive matter, but one of active receptivity, a contemplative receptivity. Admiration and feasting are not passive acts, but they are the proper response of a steward of creation. Both Hadjadj and Berry critique a current in contemporary environmentalism, which focuses on the preservation of pristine landscapes, unspoiled, as it were, by human activity. Can you imagine these kind of Sierra Club posters? There's no people in them. Such a vision, which divorces humanity from the rest of creation, fails to see each one as made for the other, though not, of course, as the other's final end. Perhaps it is more obvious to see that the non-human creatures are made for the human. We eat them, we build our homes from them. God says in Genesis that he gives them to us, etc. But we humans, stewards that we are also priests in the biblical vision. And the role of the priest is to offer the creation back to the Creator in praise. All things come from you, and of your own have we given you. St. Augustine writes at the beginning of his Confessions, great are you, Lord, and highly to be praised. Great is your power, and your wisdom is beyond measure. And human beings want to praise you. They, who are just a portion of your creation, who carry around their mortality, who carry around the evidence of their own sin, and the evidence that you resist the proud. And yet human beings, this portion of your creation, want to praise you. How do we, this portion of the creation go about this? From the beginning, we have always known to celebrate the other portion. O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom hast thou made them all. The earth is full of thy creatures. Yonder is the sea, great and wide, which teems with things innumerable, living things both small and great. We have needed the other portion for our sustenance, of course, and have learned to exercise dominion over it through our labor, more and more refined. But, as Hadjadj puts it in a passage that sums up much of what we have said tonight, the work of the celebrant, priest or poet, is the source and summit of all true technique. This technique, by marveling at the vine, by admiring the lamb or the red heifer, by sensing their gift and their mystery, generates both a drive and a restraint, and even a drive by means of restraint, like the riverbanks without which the water would cease to flow and would spread out into a stagnant swamp. Celebration keeps logging from turning into devastation, and animal husbandry into zootechnics and the mechanized slaughter which forgets our own sacrificial destiny. Indeed, we will all die whether we recycle or not. And this world, as we are told, is passing away. If our goal in sustainability is simply to preserve it as it is, in the long run, a fool's errand. The Earth's water will evaporate. The sun will expand to consume our planet. And in the end, the universe itself will grow cold. But in the face of this, Hadjadj would remind us that a natural being's final end is not its own preservation, but rather its specific form and operation, its activity. If a being's final end were simply to last the longest possible amount of time, it seems rather a waste for there to be anything more complex than a stone. After all, it's a lot harder to preserve yourself if you are a giraffe or a tulip than if you are a stone. The blackbird's song is no doubt useful for its preservation, as the evolutionary biologists tell us. But, Hadjadj argues, it does not sing to preserve itself. It preserves itself to sing. And so that there is, for a time in the world, a blackbird in all its distinctiveness. The bird dies, but it has crossed the skies with its flight and its song, and with a grace that no stone can know. And so it is as an apparition, indeed, as a revelation, that a living being offers itself, and not as permanence or immutability. A revelation that we, the portion of the creation who can see it, are called to celebrate. And so we care for the creation, not only for our neighbor, not only for ourselves, but to worship the Creator, who has revealed himself in and through it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions. We'll do questions into the mic. I'm going to turn on this second mic.
Test. You said the decree for the sabbatical year, which the Jews would do, you mentioned for the earth to give it its rest, and you mentioned how that decree was not for greater productivity. How do you know the motivations behind this decree? Was it written down in the Bible somewhere?
I mean, is this...
There it is.
That particular passage, I don't think it's spelled out explicitly. But if you look elsewhere in the scripture at stories where restraint is enjoined on the Israelites, you see that this is about trust and relinquishment oriented to God, right? You think of the story of the manna, for instance, where you're not to collect on one day of the week, where you trust. So I agree that it's not spelled out explicitly there, but I think reading the overarching narrative, we see that the gleaning, or the lack of grasping is not meant simply to produce more.
Thank you for your talk. I was curious, just to kind of follow up on that, what would be the role of productivity in the Christian vision, and what separates, delineates that from this greedy overuse and straining it to the last drop? Because I think there's a call to be productive, probably, in Scripture.
Sure.
And, yeah.
To subdue the earth, to have dominion over it, implies effort, right? It implies developing culture in the sense of what Hadjadj was talking about, of the land, of welcoming natural forms. All of that implies that that work is a good, right? And that productivity, in some sense, is enjoined on us. I think it's very difficult to draw a general line between what is a healthy productivity and what is a grasping productivity. I think even in each one of our own lives, really only we can discern, have I been doing this in a spirit of relinquishment, this project that I'm working on, or have I been doing this because I've been concerned to push things to the max in my life, to get the most out of every moment of my week? So, yeah, I think that it's hard to generalize about what distinguishes these things. I think probably the litmus test is, are we able to set the work down, right? With confidence, with trust.
Yeah, second question here. You mentioned a being's final end, its purpose, and then you brought up a metaphor of the blackbird singing for a being not having a purpose for something, or perhaps having some kind of worshipful purpose. But a blackbird's song has a specific purpose. It's to find a mate. Is the end goal of everything reproduction? What is the end goal of everything?
Right. The evolutionary biologists tell us that the end goal of everything is reproduction, is permanence, right? But this is not a question that I think science is equipped to answer, right? Science does not answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? That goes for the universe and for the blackbird. So Hadjadj is certainly not excluding that the blackbird's song may be useful for its survival, but he is saying that the final end, the question of why, can't be reduced to survival. That there would be nothing animating a kind of evolution if the purpose were merely survival. Survival is much easier if you're inanimate, right? It's a lot easier to remain. Water can stay water a lot easier than I can stay human. I'm going to die. Animals are going to die. Plants are going to die. So I'm not sure if that is helpful.
I detect a subtle indictment of industrialization in these topics. And I'm wondering if you can comment on technology versus industrialization.
The beginning of the Sabbath of the earth.
Mastery.
What's that?
The idea of mastering mastery.
Yeah. So mastering mastery, which is Heidegger's challenge to us now. The question is, we originally developed our machines and our technology to master the earth, and it seems that our machines have gotten away from us. And so now we need to master the mastery, right? So again, I think nothing intrinsic to technology would bother Hadjadj. He does this kind of thought experiment in the Sabbath of the Earth, and says, what if we did master mastery? What if we did manage to lick our problems with fossil fuels, and the ozone was fine, and there was no risk of nuclear meltdowns and wars and things like that? Wouldn't things be great then? We mastered our technology that seemed to be getting away from us. And he says resoundingly, no, this would be hell, because we would think at that point that we had made it, that even retaining our grasping attitude, now pushed to optimal efficiency with no risk of destruction, we'd still be locked in this mindset of producing and building on our own, and that would be a spiritual catastrophe. So I'm not sure that he draws a hard and fast line between technology and industry. He does observe, as Berry does, that the rise of technology and industry correlates or corresponds to a kind of exponential rise in our graspingness. But it's not, right? The problem isn't technology per se. It's this spiritual problem. It's interesting how many environmental writers will identify this as a spiritual problem, actually, from across the spectrum.
I'm wondering if there's any. I'm trying to think of the word. It's the end of a long day. Like tidbits that you've kind of gleaned in this work to speak, because it seems as though the American church has more or less kind of missed the boat, and in some ways even like actively resistant. Especially I was thinking about this when you're talking about being stewards and like the earth making some kind of a claim on us. I almost feel as though they'll be like actively resisted, as if, because it almost sounds like it's some kind of like a hippie countercultural movement kind of a thing. And so we have like cultural pieces that have made it really hard, I think.
Or a leftist conspiracy.
Wait, say that again?
Or a leftist conspiracy.
Yeah, for sure. And so is there I don't know, anything in there that could speak into our kind of cultural moment on these things?
Diagnosing it or proposing remedies? Yeah. Hadjadj doesn't write much about America. It's not his context. I mean, he has, like Berry, he has observed that our free market lends itself to this kind of scorning of the earth. I think neither of them are in favor of a kind of command economy, but the church, in that essay, God and Country, Berry takes aim directly at the American church and argues that we have bought into the economy, betraying our own spiritual heritage. Right? So there are no sweeping solutions that either of these writers propose. They're not proposing political solutions, right? They're offering an ethic. They're offering a new vision, and I think that as far as the church goes, that's maybe the most practical thing to do would simply be to nurture and talk about that vision more, because that Berry writes about this very very clearly. He says, we can organize. People can come together as consumers and demand better laws and things like this. But really, it comes down to individual responsibility. Am I going to purchase this? Am I going to throw this away? Am I going to buy a single use, something like this? And so I think their position on this finally is that this is a matter of the heart, and that if an institution such as the church has become beholden to the dominant way of just grab it, toss it, we're on to the next thing, only on an individual level is that going to be walked back.
I guess I'm getting the microphone next, Josh. My question was similar because it feels like there's an entrenchment of culture in this grasping for. And we're at Hope College, which is a Christian college. It's a college to educate students to go on to careers. And I feel like sometimes as I teach my classes, it feels like an uphill battle to try and to both push them to study and get better and train them, and at the same time pull them back into this idea that the earth matters and that grasping for all these things isn't the end all be all. So I was just wondering, kind of from a professor standpoint, or for the students here, kind of how you would frame that in terms of as they graduate, where they should how far they should push themselves to succeed in this culture and how much they should resist it.
That's a great question. Again, hard for me to offer generalizations. One thing that comes to mind, when Wendell Berry talks about the university, one of his great laments is that people go off to college and then they leave their communities, never to be seen again. Or maybe at Thanksgiving and the holidays, right? But they don't feel any attachment. This is certainly true of me. I'm from outside Philadelphia, right? You're from California. And so this is just the norm for us to grow up, go to college. Oh, I'm going to get an internship, in this place in the summer. And then I'm going to study abroad here. And then I'm going to live for 5 years here and 6 years there. And it doesn't really matter where I end up. And I think that one encouragement that I intend to give my own children and that I will give you students is to think of place as not a totally irrelevant consideration, right? That, yes, you may be called to live in somewhere far from your home someday, but it's not just a matter of course. I think that there should be a good reason, right? And it's not just because, you're making 6 figures in some far city. So that's one thing that, the idea of care of a place and care of the people in the place helps us, I think, starts to temper that bigger, better mentality, lowers our horizon. I think not in a defeatist way, but in a humanizing way. The other thing I would say is that we have to be honest. I'm not a farmer. I'm not out there, raising my own crops and composting everything. But there are incremental things that can be done. Just because I'm not going to live like an Amish person doesn't mean I can't start to slowly turn, the cruise ship of my consumer habits in a better direction. And I think that it's incumbent on each of us in our own individual circumstances to discern what are the ways that we can slowly start to do this ourselves, and we'll become models for each other in this. You seem like you were paying attention, and I appreciate that.
Hello again. So you mentioned that we should resist throwaway culture and kind of try to take personal responsibility for the damage on the planet. And I just wanted to ask, do you think it's part of our duty as guardians of Earth to kind of throw out the corruptive influences? And if so, then why should we allow these billion-dollar corporations that are doing most of the polluting, even if they're doing it through our demand for it, why should we allow them to exist, as it were?
I don't know how much, choice we have in the matter. As consumers, we can decide what to do, which products we're going to support, and that might mean spending more of our money on certain things. I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road, I think. Maybe not so much in lobbying the American government to do something about Monsanto or one of these multinational organizations that's wreaking havoc on the environment, but saying like, you know what, I don't think chickens should be cooped up like this their whole lives. I'm going to pay $5 for my eggs instead of $2.50 or something like that. And with our own, and I'm not saying that that's not the homework assignment here, if you will, but I think, yeah, in an ideal world, these kinds of corporations would look very different. They wouldn't be wasteful. They wouldn't foul people's homes. But we're not. I don't think it's at all realistic to expect that we're going to accomplish this through policy. Right? I think we accomplish it if we're not even accomplishing getting rid of the corporations as a first step. We're just trying to train our own impulses so that we're doing this out of love, right? Not unthinkingly.
So you talked a lot through your talk about like how we shape our impulses, how we choose this receptivity, particularly in how we approach the idea of Sabbath. What is the result of that? What does it look like? I know in Israel, you talked about how in Israel they go back and there's like a restart, but in more of an agricultural application for us now, what does it look like in places where people are doing this the right way?
Eighth Day Farm downtown, right? This is a community-based agricultural CSA. Blanking on. There we go. A Berryan inspired CSA, right? Again, we're not all going to go start a farm unless you want to, honey, because we could do that. But most of us are not going to do that. But I think what it looks like is, as consumers, we start supporting people who are trying to take care of the land. Wendell Berry doesn't think everybody needs to live on a farm. Wendell Berry's fine with people living in cities, but he thinks that the people who live in cities have a responsibility to make sure that the things that they are consuming aren't coming at the cost of the surrounding communities. What is the effect on the people? I think he says that they live with more integrity, right? Not feedback. When I was talking earlier about embodying the imago Dei, we become more who we're supposed to be. Here's a word that is important both to Hadjadj and to Berry. Loneliness. There's a certain loneliness that comes from being caught up in this bigger, better cycle, right? I'm alienated from the community where I live, from the people, because I'm getting fast food here. I'm getting, ordering this online. I'm not actually talking to people. You can order sandwiches now. You don't have to communicate with people. I do all these things, by the way. I'm not the saint here. But I think they're right in saying that this produces a kind of loneliness, both from the land, but also from each other. And again, you see this with an operation like Eighth Day Farm. They're farming together, and they're coming together, and they're feasting together. And I think that there is a new fellowship that will slowly start to emerge as we make choices to care for our place. And the other thing I would say is that when you have this kind of attention to the creation, it's a natural source of wonder. It's a natural source of contemplation. And for some people, that's going to inspire art. For other people, like me, I'm not going to inflict my art on anyone, but I'm going to be thankful, right? In a way that I wouldn't have been if I had ignored, if I had not slowed down. So those two things, fellowship and just the intrinsic good of seeing the earth as the gift that it is. It doesn't have a more instrumental or kind of practical outwork anything sometimes, other than the fact that, wow, I'm glad to live in the community where I live. I'm glad to walk where I get to walk. I think that's a good that also comes of this.
Hi.
Yes.
So you kind of like going back to one of the other questions, you mentioned like that we should be like striving for the like reduction of like consumeristic, like just like the throwaway culture. But going back to your first example, the like measuring cups that like say they're good for the planet, like is that not out of an earnest desire to like purchase something that has benefit, but like corporations take advantage of our desire to do this with greenwashing? Like they're making money off the fact that we want to do something good, even though they're not actually truthfully doing good with it. So how do we?
I mean, if they're not doing good with it, then shame on them. If they are doing good with it, then I have no problem with them making money off of that, right? I mean, that's I think a noble form of business. So, yeah, I said that in jest, but if the measuring spoon CEO was really cared, then fine, that's great. I'll buy his spoons. But the ones that don't, yeah, then they shouldn't do that. And there's all kinds of choices we make as consumers that are fraught, right? The clothes that we buy, the things that we. So I can't tell everybody in this room. You need to carefully examine every product and make sure that if they're saying that they're environmentally friendly, they actually are.
I think that this is still on over here, but so I just wanted to comment on the Sabbath, and so that idea of slowing down, especially on Sunday, and taking that time with your family, maybe spending some time outside, different things like that. And then also the comment about like 8-day farms. We've had a ton of students here from Hope who volunteered there over the summer, or done internships. We've done work days there. And it seems like almost every student who's had that opportunity to go out there, get their hands dirty in some way, tending to the earth, they all come back a little bit different, a little bit changed. And I think that's not an accident, I think that it is that strong connection to being out in the earth. And a lot of people can say that the same thing when they go for a walk outside or some of those kinds of things. It's finding that connection, but it's not to the extent of worshiping creation, which I think is where a lot of like religious groups will come at it and saying that we're worshiping creation, but really we're honoring it and reflecting in it about God's work.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
You use the phrase at least once, source and summit.
Yeah, that was 20 years apart. Those essays were 20 years apart, and he used the exact same.
Sure. And Catholic Bishop Robert Barron speaks of the Eucharist as source and summit. The Eucharist, Christ's offering on the cross, is the ultimate relinquishment. Do Hadjadj or Berry point to our sacramental participation as a pathway, perhaps, to becoming the kind of people who can live lives that are Sabbath-oriented, relinquishing control, trusting and praising God? Do they speak to that?
Ask again. Do they speak to?
Do they point to the sacraments and
Mm-hmm.
specifically
Okay.
Eucharistic participation as one of the ways in which we are oriented and changed to live according to a
judge does. Berry might. I don't know. Maybe my colleague could illuminate us. But a judge does. He has a lovely talk on bees and think he starts it off talking about the buzz of the bees, which it's basically a meditation on the fact that in liturgy, so the bees, who make wax that eventually goes into the Paschal candle. In liturgy, we bring elements from the earth to our worship. They go into the Paschal candle, they go into the bread, they go into the wine. And Hadjadj asks us to think about this long and hard and ask ourselves, are we at peace with the elements we've brought to the elements, basically? The kinds of things that we're growing in our soil and the ways that we've used to grow them. Are our consciences easy bringing those to be used in the Eucharist? That should be a source of reflection for us, because this is the moment where we are, it's the source and summit, where we are giving back, but communing with God. And so for him, that, again, is a kind of a litmus test for the way we are treating the creation, in as much as the creation returns to God in that very tangible way in the Eucharist.
Dr. Kraut, I have a question.
Yeah.
So this idea from Leviticus of kind of leaving the edge of the fields ungleaned, unharvested, that's kind of one of the ideals, it seems, that Hadjadj and Berry have for, something of how we run our agriculture. But how do we implement that? Or, with our factory farming, would they suggest, in those operations, they should leave some of the edges? Or is it really the idea? Or kind of how does that get implemented?
It's more the idea. For Berry, factory farming is a disaster pretty much, from start to finish. And we can get into all the, the counter arguments. Well, it feeds so many people and it's so efficient, et cetera, et cetera. And he has counter arguments to these things. But the scale for someone like Berry is just not a human scale. And so he's in favor of small holdings. And he understands that this seems laughable and ridiculous. And so I haven't read enough Berry to know exactly. I know he has been involved in crafting legislation, proposed legislation, which is not eventually implemented. So he does have an eye toward the policy level. I imagine that it's kind of working our way incrementally back. But something like factory farming is, I think I can confidently say, just not redeemable for him, in as much as it is consuming things that are meant to be renewed and consuming them in a way that they will not be renewed. That soil has become like oil, right? Soil takes a long time to form. And if we're compacting it under heavy tractors, and if it's eroding because we haven't planted in wise ways, we're not going to get that back. So, again, unachievable, utopian, perhaps, but important.
So kind of on that point, what would be his... So he sees someone who actually seemingly cares and saying, hey, we want more of these factories to feed more people. Would he point to that and say that's like a lack of faith, sort of, or in reminiscent to the bread, the manna, and the person being like, no, I'm just getting more food so I can feed more people on the day when there is no manna? Would he say it just kind of like take that leap of faith? God will provide abundantly more than even if you're to do this.
I think so.
Yeah.
I want to go back to a passage I read. This is from Berry. He says, the arguments for cheapness, efficiency, labor-saving economic growth, etc., all point to infinite industrial growth and infinite energy consumption. The moral argument points to restraint. And this is the key phrase. It is a conclusion that may be, in some sense, tragic, but there is no escaping it. And I wonder, in reading that, what he means by tragic. As in, my hunch is that Berry has acknowledged the great benefits that the industrial age has brought us, right? The comforts, medical, cures and things like that. But he's still able to ask the question, at what cost, right? And he's able to ask the question, is this actually better in the long run? If you're in an industrial system that runs a real risk of poisoning or destroying food sources in a permanent way, are you really better off pursuing them at maximum capacity, even though you may be getting higher yields in the interim? If you take the long view, right, the reckoning in the long view, Berry says, this is not going to help our neighbors in the long run, right? This is actually going to be self-defeating. And so, yeah, something like you take the leap of faith, it's constrained, right? Whatever you do is constrained by this ethic of relinquishment.
I think this has been touched on a little bit, but about the Sabbath of the earth, with the 6 years working the land and then the 7th year not working the land. I was just wondering, is like, obviously I'm not a farmer, I don't work the land at all. So like, how could I apply that in my life? Is it more the idea of not pushing to the borders and then just kind of not thinking about the whole 6th year, 7th year situation? Or is there, do you have any thoughts on that for like non-farming people?
For us non-farmers, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The principle there, I guess there's two kind of realms in which I think of this, right? There's the realm of the earth, properly speaking, right? Like what's the analogy in my life, in my care for the earth, of not plowing to the edges? That's one realm. And then the other realm is my receptivity to God in general, right? How do I not plow to the edges of my life, and assume that I am able to do anything I set my heart to in a way that burns me out, affects my relationships with others, etc. So we could maybe talk about these two realms. In the realm of the care of creation, I think a lot of this has to do with our willingness to forbear and say, okay, it would be more convenient for me to have a lot of, say, single-use items in my home, right? Don't have to wash this thing, just chuck it, right? Because that would save me like 10 minutes every day or 5 minutes every day. And I can use that 5 minutes to be super productive. Okay, fine. Like, if you are, I don't know, if you're the head of the Fed and you need every single minute because all these super important policies depend on you, then use your single-use thing, right? But I think for a lot of us, this is just a prudential decision. Do I need to do everything in the most convenient way for me that I can, whatever the cost to the earth? And I think for a lot of us, if we look at our lives, there's some fat that we could trim. Like, I could give you some really embarrassingly small examples. Like, I've been meaning to buy handkerchiefs for years. I keep using tissues. Why am I using tissues? Handkerchiefs work, Okay, I gotta throw them in the wash once a week. Things like that, right? I'm being honest here. I'm being vulnerable. But some things, I remember over time, and so I start to do them, right? I've worked at Hope College for 8 years. It was only 3 months ago, maybe even prompted by this talk, that I brought a dish towel into my office so that I wouldn't use paper towels to dry off my bowl that I've been using for 8 years, right? Like, why did it take me 8 years? I don't know. What's wrong? So these are embarrassingly small examples of how I say, okay, my day is not so precious. Every second of my day is not so precious that I can't take a little bit of time and throw a dish towel in the washing machine. That's the kind of mentality that I'm talking about. And so that's the realm of the earth, care of the earth. With respect to kind of the maximum capacity or maximum efficiency of our lives, I think this is where we just decide we're not going to do work on the Sabbath. We're not going to do, Dr. Tees calls it tedious work on the Sabbath, right? And we're going to say, it's going to be okay. I'm not going to work on this paper because it's, whatever day you take your Sabbath. I'm not going to, apply for these 6 jobs. I'm going to be receptive. I'm going to be thankful for the life that I have and trust that it's not my own efforts that are going to secure my future, right? Those are the kinds of, personal, devotional ways in which I think that metaphor can apply.
Oh, no, I've got the mic. I'm going to give an opinion and make it sound like a question. Do you think that the essay, Dorothy Sayers' essays on the value of good work, could be a way to apply this to academics who want to, or people, college students, people in academia?
What part of her essays?
The idea of
that work is noble?
Like choosing to do a valuable thing. Like when we do our work in this building where we don't touch the ground, that there's the doing the work because the work itself is good versus doing the work because it'll get us ahead. Like a way to posture yourself in a way of receptivity rather than grasping within sort of the general college student kind of day.
Yeah, as a way to summarize what you're asking / saying, that we need to be discerning about what we undertake to do. And as long as we're choosing things that are worth doing, that we will kind of, as a side effect, be abiding by these principles of the Sabbath. Is that what you're suggesting? I think it's actually a problem for Sayers, who in that essay imagines a world in which people are dying to get to work, in which work is so noble that nobody would want time off. I think that's actually a problem in Sayers' view of work. I think it's great that she wants work to be noble and to be worth doing, but with her view of work, I don't know that there is. I have not seen where the Sabbath enters into it.
I'm afraid I'm making you repeat something you've already touched on.
That's okay.
But with regards to the Sabbath, you talk about it a lot, that it has a spirit of relinquishment. I've heard a lot of people say that you're supposed to do something life-giving on the Sabbath. So a good example is don't spend your whole Sabbath on TikTok. Can you talk a bit more about what you should be doing rather than what you shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath?
What you should be doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this I think will have to be the last question because we are at time. So, what should you be doing on the Sabbath? Not TikTok, yes. Berry and Hadjadj would agree. And the rabbi that I quoted earlier, Heschel, would agree too, that you're not vegging out. You're not just waiting for your stores of energy to come back so that you can get back to work on Monday. Active receptivity, contemplative receptivity were the expressions that Hadjadj uses. This connects to the idea of leisure. And I think when we rest well, we are allowing ourselves to perceive the true, the good, and the beautiful. But that is what gives us our rest. Taking in what is the fundamental reality. This is Joseph Pieper. When we perceive the world as it really is, that this is what restores us. right? We've probably all had these experiences. You go, you see an amazing movie or an amazing piece of art or hear an amazing piece of music. You've been put in touch with something that is truly good or beautiful or truly true. And that restores you, right? So each person's going to be different. But I would say that trying to put yourself in the way of beauty, put yourself in the way of goodness, put yourself in the way of truth, whether it's reading something, watching something, spending time with a good friend and talking about something, working on an idea. Those are the things that I think the Sabbath is about. That's what real rest is.